For 25 years, the old Whitaker house was a local ghost story, the place where a young couple vanished after a concert in 1980, leaving everything behind. When Robert, the new owner, began renovations, he saw it as just a house. But as he pried up a loose floorboard in the dusty basement, his crowbar struck a small, sealed box. Wiping away the grime, he realized it wasn't just debris, it was a time capsule, intentionally hidden, containing their final, desperate plan. What they planned for and what truly happened are two very different stories, and the truth has been buried for a quarter of a century. Stick with me as we uncover what was inside that box and solve the mystery of the Whitaker house. Robert wasn't a man who believed in ghosts. He believed in solid foundations, level floors, and the satisfying ache in his muscles after a long day of work. That's why he'd bought the old Whitaker place on the edge of town. The price was next to nothing, mainly because nobody else wanted it. For the people of Harmony Creek, the two-story house wasn't a fixer-upper. It was a landmark of tragedy, a place frozen in time since the fall of 1980, when Charles and Mary, the young couple who lived there, simply ceased to exist. They went to a rock concert one Friday night and never came back. Their car was found a week later in a long-term parking lot at the bus station 2 towns over, but there was no sign of them. The story the town settled on was simple. They ran away to start a new life. But the house they left behind felt different. It felt like it was holding its breath. Robert had heard all the stories. He'd smiled and nodded when the hardware store owner warned him about strange noises and flickering lights. He was a practical man. The only thing haunting the Whitaker house was rotted wood, leaky pipes, and a thick layer of dust that covered every surface like a shroud. For 3 weeks, he'd worked from dawn until dusk, gutting the kitchen, tearing out old carpets, and slowly stripping the house back to its bones. The basement was his final frontier. It was a dark, damp space with a packed dirt floor and stone walls that smelled of wet earth and decay. He'd put on his thick work gloves and a headlamp, determined to check the integrity of the floor joists supporting the main level. He was running his hand along a thick wooden beam when he noticed it. One of the wide, rough-hewn floorboards in the corner wasn't quite flush with the others. It was barely noticeable, but Robert had an eye for detail. He knelt, pressing on the edge. It gave slightly. Curiosity, a tool he used as often as his hammer, took over. He grabbed his crowbar from his tool belt and wedged the tip into the narrow gap. With a grunt, he put his weight into it. The old nails screeched in protest as the board groaned and lifted, releasing a puff of stale, musty air. There, nestled in the dark soil beneath, was a box. It wasn't a fancy chest or anything like the stories might suggest. It was a simple metal lunchbox, the kind a factory worker might carry, its blue paint faded and scratched. Someone had wrapped thick, black electrical tape around the seam where it opened, sealing it tight against the dampness of the earth. Robert's heart gave a little thump. This wasn't part of the renovation plan. He carefully lifted the box out. It was heavier than he expected. He shook it gently, hearing a soft thud of something solid inside. He carried it upstairs, away from the gloom of the basement, and set it on the dusty kitchen counter where the afternoon sun streamed through a dirty window. For a moment, he just stared at it. This felt different from finding an old bottle or a forgotten tool. This felt personal. This belonged to them. He took out his utility knife and carefully slit through the layers of brittle, sticky tape. The lid popped open with a sigh of air. Inside, the contents were perfectly preserved. On top lay 2 paper tickets, slightly yellowed with age. The Titans of Rock, the heading read. October 17th, 1980. Beneath them was a faded Polaroid photograph. It was the two of them, Charles and Mary, standing in front of the house, his arm around her shoulder. They were smiling, the kind of wide, carefree smiles that only belong to the young. Charles with his shaggy brown hair and denim jacket, and Mary, her eyes bright and full of life. They looked like they had their whole future ahead of them. Under the photo was a folded piece of notebook paper. Robert's hands, calloused and steady just moments before, trembled slightly as he picked it up. He unfolded it carefully, the creases stiff from years of being hidden. The handwriting was neat, a looping cursive written in blue ink. It was a letter. "If you're reading this, it means we made it," the letter began. "It means we're free." Robert sat down on an overturned bucket, the silence of the empty house pressing in on him. He read on, and the ghost story of the Whitaker house began to unravel, replaced by a tale of quiet desperation and a desperate plan for escape. The letter was from Mary. She wrote about her father, William, a man respected in town, a man of wealth and influence. But behind closed doors, he was a tyrant. She wrote of his iron fist, his explosive rage, and the way he controlled every aspect of her life. He hated Charles, seeing him as a penniless distraction from the future William had planned for his daughter. "He told me he would ruin Charles," Mary wrote. "He said he would see him in jail, or worse, before he ever let me be with him. I believe him. I've seen the darkness in his eyes." The concert was their cover. Their plan was simple and brave. After the show, they weren't coming home. They were going to take the small amount of money they'd saved, drive their car to the bus station to throw off anyone looking for them, and then take a bus heading west. At the bottom of the letter was one last item, a hand-drawn map. It was sketched on the back of a napkin, showing a series of back roads leading deep into the state forest about 80 miles north. A small X was marked next to a creek with the words, "Our cabin," written beside it. "We buried this box before we left," the letter concluded. "One day, when we're old and gray and Dad is long gone, we'll come back for it. We'll come back to the house where we fell in love and remember the night we chose freedom." Robert folded the letter and placed it gently back in the box. The air in the room felt heavy. These weren't happy runaways. They were fugitives, fleeing from a real and present danger. They hadn't abandoned their home. They had been driven from it, and they had never come back to dig up their box. A cold knot formed in Robert's stomach. He looked at the smiling faces in the photo, then at the crude map. He couldn't just nail that floorboard back down. He couldn't pretend he hadn't found this. For the first time, he felt the presence of Charles and Mary in the house, not as ghosts, but as two young people whose story had never been finished. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to be the one to finish it. The next morning, Robert drove into town, the blue metal box sitting on the passenger seat beside him. The Harmony Creek Police Department was a small brick building that hadn't changed much since 1980. The officer at the front desk looked at him with bored curiosity as Robert explained he had information on a cold case. He was led to a small office in the back where a man with tired eyes and a graying mustache introduced himself as Detective Paul. "The Whitaker case?" Paul said, leaning back in his squeaky chair. "Son, that case is as cold as it gets. What could you possibly have?" Robert didn't say anything. He just opened the lunchbox and placed the contents on the detective's cluttered desk. The tickets, the photo, the letter, the map. Paul's tired expression slowly dissolved, replaced by one of intense focus. He picked up the letter, his eyes scanning the page. He read it once, then a second time. "William?" he murmured, more to himself than to Robert. "I remember him. Big man in town. Owned the lumber mill." He was adamant they just ran off, said his daughter was always a wild child. He shut down every question we had about his family. Robert pointed to the map. They were headed here, to a cabin. Detective Paul stared at the hand-drawn map for a long time. He got up and walked over to a large framed map of the county hanging on his wall. He traced the route with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This area here," he said, tapping a remote section of the state forest. "It's rugged. Not many people go up there." He went back to his desk and began typing on his computer, the keys clicking loudly in the quiet office. He pulled up old Forestry Service records and cross-referenced them with county archives. Robert waited, the silence stretching on. The hope that had filled him yesterday was now tangled with a growing sense of dread. "Well, I'll be," the detective finally said, leaning back from his screen. "There's something here." He turned the monitor toward Robert. "About a year after your couple disappeared, in the summer of '81, there was a massive flash flood up in that exact part of the forest. A real 100-year storm caused a series of landslides." He paused, his gaze meeting Robert's. According to these old park ranger logs, the slide unearthed a grave. They found two bodies, a young man and a young woman. No identification. Robert felt the air leave his lungs. What happened to them? "At the time, nobody local was missing," Paul explained. "The working theory was they were out-of-state hikers caught in a storm. No one ever came forward to identify them. After a while, they were buried as a John and Jane Doe in a county plot." He looked from the computer screen to the smiling photo of Charles and Mary. No one ever thought to connect them. Everyone in Harmony Creek thought these two were 1,000 miles away, living a new life. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture far darker than a simple runaway story. They didn't make it. They never got to be old and gray. Their desperate bid for freedom had ended in a shallow grave on a lonely mountainside. "What about the father?" Robert asked, his voice low. William? Detective Paul's expression hardened. William is still alive, lives in a big house up on Cedar Ridge. He's an old man now, but I think it's about time we paid him a visit. He looked at Robert. You found the box. You started this. You want to come? Robert nodded. I have to. The drive up to Cedar Ridge was quiet. William's house was a large, imposing structure set back from the road, with perfectly manicured lawns and large windows that seemed to stare down at the town below. It was the kind of house that was built to keep people out. Detective Paul knocked on the heavy oak door. After a moment it opened, and an old man with a sour expression and cold, pale eyes stood before them. It was William. He was frail, leaning heavily on a cane, but the arrogance in his posture was unmistakable. What do you want? He snapped, his voice a gravelly rasp. Mr. William, Detective Paul said, his tone even. I'm Detective Paul. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your daughter, Mary. A flicker of something, annoyance or maybe fear, crossed William's face. My daughter? She ran off 25 years ago. I have nothing to say about her. We found a letter she wrote, Paul pressed on, holding up the evidence bag with the letter inside. A letter about you, about why she had to leave. William's eyes narrowed into slits. That's a lie. She was a foolish girl, led astray by that worthless boy. They broke her mother's heart. She also drew us a map, Paul continued, his voice calm but firm. A map to a cabin in the state forest. A cabin right where 2 unidentified bodies were found after a landslide in 1981. The color drained from William's face. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his cane. For a single, breathless moment, the mask of the powerful old man fell away, revealing a flash of pure panic. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, his voice losing its strength. That's ridiculous. Now get off my property before I call my lawyer. He slammed the door in their faces. As they walked back to the car, Robert knew. The detective knew too. William wasn't just a grieving father. He was a liar. And his lie had held for 25 years. We need proof, Paul said as he started the car, and there's only one way to get it. The next step required a judge's signature. With the new evidence from the lunchbox and William's suspicious reaction, Detective Paul got a court order to exhume the bodies of the John and Jane Doe, who had been buried for over 2 decades. The final, undeniable proof lay in their DNA. For the comparison, they needed a genetic sample from a living relative. They needed a sample from William. When Detective Paul and 2 uniformed officers returned to the imposing house on Cedar Ridge, they didn't knock. They presented the warrant. William, cornered and out of options, seemed to shrink before their eyes. The fight went out of him, replaced by the hollow emptiness of a man whose time had run out. As a medical technician prepared to take a simple cheek swab, the old man collapsed into a chair and began to talk. The truth, held back for a quarter of a century, came pouring out in a broken, rambling confession. He had known about their plan. He'd found a draft of Mary's letter in her room days before the concert. On that Friday night, he hadn't stayed home. He'd followed them. He watched them go to the concert, and he waited. He waited in the shadows outside their small house as they returned, filled with nervous excitement for the new life ahead of them. He confronted them in their living room as they were grabbing their packed bags. He remembered the look of defiance on Charles's face and the look of fear in his own daughter's eyes. He'd lost control. He lunged at Charles, and the 2 of them struggled. Mary screamed, trying to pull her father off the boy she loved. In the chaos, William shoved her away. It wasn't a hard push, he claimed, but she was off balance. She stumbled backward, and the back of her head struck the sharp corner of the stone fireplace hearth. She fell to the floor and didn't move again. The sight of his daughter, lifeless on the floor, broke something inside him. All his rage turned on Charles. He blamed the boy for everything. He silenced him, ending the young man's life right there in the small house. In a panic, he'd staged the scene to look like they had simply left. He drove their car to the bus station himself. Then, under the cover of darkness, he took their bodies in his own truck, driving them up the winding mountain roads to the remote, abandoned cabin he knew about from his lumber mill days. He buried them together in a shallow grave and drove home, locking the secret away. He never imagined a flood would bring his crime to light, but by then, the unidentified bodies were just another mystery, disconnected from the runaways from Harmony Creek. A week later, Robert stood at the back of a small crowd gathered in the town cemetery. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the oak trees. 2 new headstones stood side by side. Charles and Mary, they were finally being laid to rest, their names restored, their story known. Robert saw a few of their old high school friends, now middle-aged, wiping tears from their eyes. He had only known the couple through a faded photograph and a desperate letter, but he felt a profound sense of connection to them, a duty fulfilled. After the service, he went back to the house. It no longer felt empty or haunted. The renovation was nearly complete. The walls were painted a warm, cheerful yellow. The floors were sanded and polished, gleaming in the afternoon light. It was a place ready for a new life. He'd planned to sell it, to take his profit, and move on to the next project. But standing in the living room, in the exact spot where their young lives had been so brutally cut short, he knew he couldn't. Selling it felt like erasing them all over again. He decided to stay. He would be the one to bring life back into the Whitaker house. He would tend the garden and fix the porch swing and light a fire in the fireplace on cold nights. He would live there, not as a monument to a tragedy, but in quiet honor of the two young people who had only wanted the same thing. The house on the edge of Harmony Creek was no longer a ghost story. It was just a home, finally at peace. It's a chilling thought that a secret like that can be hidden in plain sight for so long, all because one person's lie was easier for a town to believe than the difficult truth. Do you think the people in town, the friends and neighbors, should have questioned the story more? Or was William's power and influence enough to silence any doubt? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you found yourself drawn into this story of a long-lost secret finally brought to light, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We explore new mysteries every week, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Thanks for listening.